Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 417. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today joined by co-host Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing?
Doing very well, Kyle. How are you?
Doing well. Happy to have you back on. A lot to talk about on today's show. Just want to remind people to help out the show by sharing it. You can find it at the Libertarian Institute on the blog at antiwar.com. And right now at antiwar.com, there is a fundraiser, so head on over and support. There's matching funds right now, so it'll double any donation you make. It's a great way to help out the website and for us to spread really important news. You can also find Conflicts of Interest on YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee if you like to watch it. If you just like to listen, it's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. And Connor, with that, let's get into the news today. All right, first story we have here is by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, and this is pretty similar to a story that Dave had wrote and we covered on the intro of the last show, Connor, but I think it's worth reiterating because Julian Assange continues to linger in jail, and the Biden administration is trying to spin this narrative that, oh, we care about journalists around the world, and look at what Russia is doing to journalists, and look at all these other countries that, hey, just so happens we view as enemies, that we also do bad things to journalists. But this Julian Assange guy, you're not going to pay attention to him. And so the State Department refused to acknowledge on Wednesday, which marked World Press Freedom Day, that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange is a journalist. The State Department spokesperson was asked by AP reporter Matt Lee if he considers Assange to be a journalist. Matt, I'm not just going to offer a prescriptive assessment from here. Our view on Mr. Assange is that he's been charged with serious criminal conduct. Lee retorted by pointing out that anyone can face criminal charges, even Evan Gershkovich, Wall Street Journal reporter who was recently arrested by Russia. The spokesperson said the cases were completely different and refused to say whether the State Department reviews or considers Assange a journalist. So Connor, this is just like buying at the correspondence dinner where, again, Russia does something. Oh, they're bad. They hate journalists. America imprisons a journalist. Oh, that's completely different. It's not the same. He's not a journalist. Blah blah blah. So, just always important to talk about Julian Assange. Again, his case moves very slowly in British court, so he's kind of just languishing in prison. And any chance we have to talk about him is an opportunity we have to take. All right, now some really important news, Connor. Russia says Ukraine tried to kill Putin in drone attack. The Russian government said Wednesday that Ukraine tried to kill President Vladimir Putin in a drone attack that targeted the Kremlin, and said Russia has the right to respond whenever and wherever it sees fit. According to the Russian news agency TASS, the Kremlin was targeted early Wednesday morning by two drones that were taken down, destroyed by electronic warfare systems. No casualties were reported, and Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said Putin was elsewhere at the time of the attack. The Russian president was not harmed as a result of the terrorist attack. His schedule has not changed and continues as usual, Putin's press service said. For their part, Ukrainian officials denied any role in the attack. I can't repeat this message. I think it will be very clear to everyone we didn't attack Putin or Moscow. We fight for our territory. We defend our cities and villages. And that was a statement by Ukrainian President Zelensky. Zelensky's aide also denied Kiev was responsible. On Twitter, he put out attacking the Kremlin would serve no military purposes and would give Moscow the pretext to escalate. The Pentagon documents allegedly leaked by Jad Teixeira show that the U.S. was concerned about Ukraine planning attacks in Moscow and that Zelensky might not have control over his intelligence services. One leak showed that Ukraine's Secret Service, the SBU, determined its agents violated orders by attacking a Russian surveillance plane in Belarus. Another leak revealed that Ukraine postponed attacks planned in Moscow that would have coincided with the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. And so, Connor, lots of possibilities here as to what happened. It's interesting that the Kremlin says Putin wasn't there. Was this a real shot at Putin. Maybe he was there. I'm sure the Kremlin would try to downplay the actual threat to Putin's life just for PR purposes. No matter where he was, they're going to say it wasn't a real attack, that could have killed him. I guess they're probably being somewhat honest that the drones were shot down. My assumption would be at the time of escalated warfare and with the documents that have come out, Russia's probably on guard around the Kremlin, and it would be very hard to get in a drone attack on the Kremlin. So it seems kind of unlikely that Russia is telling the truth that these drones were shot down. A lot of people are floating the idea that this was a false flag. While not impossible, I don't think this is necessarily a great PR move for the Kremlin, Connor. I think if we look, for example, at the war in Yemen, where the Saudis were the aggressors there, they really tried to downplay Houthi attacks inside of Saudi Arabia, particularly anything directed at the capital. Now, occasionally, they would use it to ask for help from the Americans, but in general, they would try to downplay this because they wanted to seem like the war was going well. And if the war is going well, you're supposed to be waging it in Ukraine. And so I kind of doubt this is a false play, but it could be the pretext to build up or to take a shot at Zelensky. Now, this from just before we went on, Dave DeCamp wrote this up for antiwar.com. Russia says the U.S. was behind drone attack on the Kremlin. This is from Dmitry Peskov, again, the Kremlin spokesperson. We know very well that the decision to carry out the actions, such as the terrorist attacks, are not made by Kiev, but rather it is precisely in Washington. He added that often even the targets themselves are not determined by Kiev, but by Washington. And so this is really concerning, Connor, because if this is the actual belief in the Kremlin, whether it's true or not, then they view this as a huge escalation, that Washington will be attacking and targeting directly Putin. Very scary, very disturbing here, Connor. I really hope that, that isn't true and that really isn't the assessment within the Kremlin, but that is what they're putting out. We also have John Kirby denying this. He's the National Security Council spokesman. So, we'll see how this develops. I'm sure that Russia feels like anything Ukraine does is at least somewhat facilitated by the U.S. At the same time, who knows what the level of U.S. involvement here was, or if the U.S. actually knew that this was going to happen. So lots of question marks here. A lot of people could have carried it out, Connor. I suppose it could have been somebody within the Ukraine military without direct orders from Zelensky himself. It could have been, again, a false flag, although I think that's very unlikely. It could have been Zelensky who ordered it. There's even Ukrainian oligarchs who are running around offering money for people to take out Putin. So maybe it could have been some kind of independent actor, although just based on the fact that the drone got anywhere near the Kremlin, that does seem somewhat unlikely to me. All right, next up here, U.S. announces $300 million arms package for Ukraine. And Connor, this one will have additional ammunition for the HIMARS, 155 millimeter howitzers, 105 millimeter artillery rounds, 120 millimeter, 81 millimeter, and 60 millimeter mortar rounds, tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided tow missiles, AT-4 and Carl Gustaf anti-armor systems, Hydra 70 aircraft rockets, small arms and ammunition, demolition munition for obstacle clearing, trucks and trailers to transport heavy equipment, testing and diagnostic equipment to support vehicle maintenance repairs, and spare parts and field equipment. Now, I believe the only thing that's new is the Hydra 70 aircraft rockets. And then, it's worth noting that they should be running out of funding here, Connor, to send weapons to Ukraine, and the White House should be going to Congress sometime soon to discuss that. Next up here, Blinken says Ukraine's army in better shape than Discord leaks show. And Connor, we were very skeptical at first that the Discord leaks are authentic documents, and it sure seems like the White House is treating them as they are, where now they're even trying to spin the news to make it sound better than the leaks show. My guess is that things are probably worse than the lead show, not better. Next up, I have an article here I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Discord leads created tensions between the U.S. and Ukraine. Kiev appears frustrated with the White House over the leaks of highly classified documents. Ukrainian President Zelensky said he learned of the leaks through the media and has not yet spoken with President Joe Biden regarding the trove of documents. I did not receive any information from the White House or the Pentagon beforehand, Zelensky said. We did not have that information. I personally did not. It's definitely a bad story. The Washington Post reports the highest level conversation about the leaks to date was between Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Ukrainian counterpart. I believe Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, is also believed to have conversations with her counterparts and other Ukrainian officials. The documents, allegedly leaked by Massachusetts National Air Guardsman Jad Teixeira, paint a bleak picture for the Ukrainian war effort. The documents showed that expected counteroffensive may not succeed. Among other key revelations, the document exposed that Russian forces were disabling American-made spark bombs, Kiev is running out of air defenses, and the White House is spying on the Zelensky administration. The Ukrainian leader said he was not free to speak his mind about the documents making their way into the public eye. I cannot risk our state, Zelensky continued. Where I can speak freely, I do it, but there are high risks. I would tell anyone what I think of them, but here the story is a little different. We are all responsible. However, Zelensky was willing to express some complaints during a 1-hour private interview with Washington Post reporters. It is unprofitable for us. It was not beneficial to the reputation of the White House, and I believe it is not beneficial to the reputation of the United States, Zelensky said. The leaks have created some fractures between Washington and Kiev. The Post spoke with an unnamed Ukrainian official who believed Washington's inability to protect sensitive information could lead Kiev to sharing less intelligence with the United States. Zelensky's refusal to confirm the document's authenticity, he did refuse to confirm the document's authenticity, but claimed the leaks benefited Russia. So, Connor, that seems to me to suggest if the leaks are authentic, then if they're benefiting Russia, then they're authentic. Last quote from Zelensky for us. Anything that informs our enemies in advance one way or another is definitely a minus for us. I don't see any advantages here. All right, 2 more quick stories, Connor, before I hand it over to you. U.S. arms makers vow closer cooperation with Taiwan. And this is just one of those things where, Connor, you almost can't believe it actually happens. A group of U.S. weapons makers attended the Taiwan-U.S. Defense Industry Forum in Taipei on Wednesday and pledged to increase their cooperation with Taiwan. And so here, the people who fund our members of Congress, just openly go to Taiwan and say, we're going to use our influence to create deeper ties with you. Very, very bold, Connor. It just shows how much control the military-industrial complex has. Now, last article up here, U.S. issues warnings to China, then calls for high-level talks. Nicholas Burns, the U.S. ambassador to China, warned Beijing about supporting Moscow and called for talks during a speech on Tuesday. Burns said Washington has been unmistakably clear in its warnings to Beijing about providing Moscow with military aid for the war in Ukraine. What we need to see from China is to push Russia to remove its troops, the ambassador stated. Burns went on to demand Beijing adopt a tougher-minded stance against Moscow. Over the past year, the White House has warned China several times against sending weapons to Russia. Beijing has denied the allegations and asserted that Washington is fueling the war by providing billions in weapons to Ukraine. The diplomat downplayed China's potential role as a mediator in ending the conflict. Burns said the call between Ukrainian President Zelensky and Chinese President Xi was a good first step, but refused to say Beijing is trying to end the war. In addition to criticizing Beijing, Burns calls for high-level talks with China with certain conditions. And Connor, I think this is one of the real problems, and again, that the Biden administration doesn't understand China, is if Burns gives a speech blasting China for a bunch of different things and says that the U.S. is committed to all these policies that Beijing abhors, as I'll go over in a minute, China isn't going to be interested in talking with the U.S. And so they still don't get it. Burns is saying that China is going to have to meet us halfway. He said that China needs to drop its statement that it could use its military for to impose reunification with Taiwan. Burns also noted that Washington's dedicated to the Indo-Pacific and talked about the quadrilateral dialogue, and that the U.S. bats the Philippines. And, recently the U.S. said that if China interferes with Philippines vessels in disputed territory, then it would invoke the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty. So lots of threats going on, Connor. Not much offer of diplomacy, but these are American diplomats in the Biden administration. And with that, let's hear what's going on in the Middle East.
Yeah, absolutely. So, last week we covered the Iranian seizure of a U.S. bound Marshall Islands flagged oil tanker, the Advantage Sweet near Oman. And we were talking about how, with the constant over the last few years, especially Israeli attacks on Iranian oil tankers bound for Syria and U.S. seizures of Iranian oil under the guise of sanctions enforcement, just completely pirating it and selling it off for profit in many cases. Would lead to, retaliations by Tehran. And so now we've got this story in the Financial Times that outlines that actually 5 days prior to the Iranian seizure of the Advantage Sweet, the U.S. had stolen an Iranian oil tanker. So this is from Dave DeCamp on April 30th. Iran's tanker seizure came after the U.S. stole a shipment of Iranian oil. So Iran's recent seizure of a U.S.-bound oil tanker came after the Biden administration forced a tanker carrying Iranian oil to deliver the cargo to the U.S. instead of China. And just this gets back to, of course, the fact that the sanctions, Iran is under so many sanctions that at least for a couple of years, it's been admitted now and again in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere by U.S. officials that there is essentially nothing left to sanction in Iran except its oil trade with East Asia. And so that's what they're going to be targeting more and more, and have been, particularly during the Biden administration and especially last year. So using the pretext of sanctions enforcement, the Justice Department seized the tanker Suez Rajan with a court order with the cooperation of one company involved with the vessel after it was loaded with Iranian oil. According to Reuters, the U.S. confiscation of an Iranian oil shipment came 5 days before Iran seized the U.S.-bound Marshall Islands flagged oil tanker, the Advantage Sweet. For their part, Iranian officials say that they took the Advantage Sweet after it had collided with an Iranian fishing vessel and had tried to flee the area. A U.S. official told Financial Times that the seizure of the Advantage Sweet, quote, appears to be in retaliation for a prior U.S. seizure of Iranian oil, which Iran recently attempted to get back but failed. The U.S. has a history of seizing tankers carrying Iranian oil and gas outright stealing the cargo by selling it off for profit. Iran has also previously seized tankers in retaliation for U.S. actions. Last year, the U.S. seized a tanker carrying Iranian oil in Greece and attempted to take the cargo, but a Greek court ruled against the confiscation. Tehran had seized 2 Greek tankers in response to the U.S. move and released them after the court's ruling. In 2021, the U.S. government sold 2 million barrels of Iranian oil for $110 million from a tanker seized near the United Arab Emirates. And during the Trump administration, the U.S. sold off Iranian gas, which was bound for Venezuela. Okay, now speaking of Iran sanctions, this next story is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, again on May 1st. Lawmakers introduce bill to make law authorizing Iran sanctions permanent. A bipartisan group of lawmakers in the House and the Senate on Monday introduced a bill that would make a law authorizing sanctions on Iran permanent. And this is the 1996 Iran Sanctions Act, which gives the president the authority to impose sanctions on Iran and needs to be continuously renewed by Congress. The legislation introduced Monday, the Solidifying Iran Sanction Act, would get rid of the ISA's sunset clause. In the House, the bill was introduced by Representative Michelle Steele, a Republican from California, and it has 24 co-sponsors, including 16 Republicans and 8 Democrats. And as you may expect, Representative Michael McCaul, chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is one of the co-sponsors. And he said, the bill takes this long overdue step of striking the arbitrary sunset from the law so that sanctions will only be lifted if Iran stops its threatening behavior. Iran can't run out the clock on U.S. law, McCall said. And the Senate's version of the bill is led by Senators Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, Maggie Hassan, a Democrat from New Hampshire, and Bill Hagerty, a Republican from Tennessee, and Jackie Rosen, a Democrat from Nevada. The introduction of the legislation comes after Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen acknowledged that American sanctions on Iran have caused a, quote, real economic crisis, but haven't changed the behavior of the government, meaning the sanctions are doing little but hurting ordinary Iranians. And history has shown that U.S. sanctions do little to change the targeted government and always hurt civilians. In February, UN experts said that more Iranians, an alarming number of Iranians, are dying from thalassemia, a congenital blood disorder, due to Western sanctions, which are depriving them specifically of specialized medicines and the ingredients that are required to make them. We also know after Alina Duhan, who's great at the UN, the special rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, is discussed. In addition to her great work on Syria, has discussed how in some regions of Iran, food insecurity has hit 60%. And in the last couple of years, we've seen unemployment in Iran go to about 50%, and inflation has just been absolutely out of control. And so, of course, all these actions are only going to serve to speed up the process of the regional realignment that we're seeing in the Middle East, and a lot of these countries looking further east and working with countries, like that are in whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or BRICS and these other multipolar organizations, which can. And even Yellen, there's a great piece by Ted Snyder who just wrote for the Institute talking about how Janet Yellen is recognizing that the continual use of sanctions is actually not only weakening the dollar, but increasing this block of blacklisted countries and countries that are willing to trade with them in spite of the American sanctions. And at the same time, the more countries that get onto that blacklist, the more you increase this process or speed up this process of de-dollarization. So it weakens the U.S. On both counts. And but of course, our Congress is dancing for the Israelis here, and the hawks and the neocon think tanks, and being hawkish on Iran and supporting the sanctions is always red meat for those constituencies, which they obviously care much more about than the American people. So. Okay, so now we have another predictable consequence of these kinds of aggressive actions. Another piece from Dave DeCamp on the 3rd of May. Iranian forces seize a second oil tanker within a week. So Iranian forces seized a Panamanian-flagged oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz Wednesday, marking the second such incident within a week. According to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, the ship, the Niovi, was seized after leaving Dubai and heading towards Fujairah, another UAE port. Iranian media said that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy seized the violator vessel, but did not say why. So we'll have to see how that story develops. Okay. Now I've got a couple of interesting things here about the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Just some updates on this from Al Jazeera. So this piece is from the 29th. Saudi Arabia, Iran to reopen embassies within days. And this is Hossein Amir Abdollahian, so the foreign minister. So Saudi Arabia and Iran will reopen their embassies in each other's capitals, quote, within days. And this is from the Iranian foreign minister, Hossein Amir Abdollahian. He said in a sign of warming relations after the two countries closed their missions 7 years ago. Speaking at a news conference in Beirut on Friday, Amir Abdollahian did not give specific dates for the reopening of the embassies. The two countries reached an agreement in China earlier last month in March now, but to reestablish diplomatic relations and reopen their embassies after 7 years of tensions. Now, during the last phone call between the foreign ministers of Iran and Saudi Arabia on Eid al-Fitr, we agreed to work in the next coming days on the reopening of the Iranian and Saudi embassies in Tehran and Riyadh, Amir Abdollahian said, according to an official Arabic translation. Amir Abdollahian was speaking at the end of his visit to Lebanon, where he met with Lebanese officials, including the leader of Hezbollah, Saeed Hassan Nasrallah. The Iranian foreign minister confirmed President Ibrahim Raisi would visit Syria in the near future. More on that in a moment. And the visit would be the first by an Iranian president to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad since the war broke out in Syria in 2011. With military help and economic support from Iran and Russia, Assad was able to turn the tide of the conflict and regain control of most of his country. So Speaking of that meeting, this is from the 3rd of May from Al Jazeera again. Syria and Iran leaders signed long-term oil and trade agreements. The presidents of Iran and Syria have signed a series of long-term cooperation agreements on oil and other sectors to bolster economic ties between the two longtime allies. Iran's Ibrahim Raisi, leading a large economic and political delegation, met his Syrian counterpart Bashar al-Assad after landing in the war-torn country for a 2-day visit, an Iranian president's first visit to Damascus since 2010. The Iranian delegation includes the ministers of foreign affairs, defense, oil, roads and urban development, as well as telecommunications. Raisi is also being accompanied by a number of private sector businessmen from Iran, according to Al Jazeera's Dorsa Jabari, reporting from Tehran. Jabari said the Iranian president has signed at least 15 documents covering several lucrative economic agreements between the two countries. Tehran has been a main backer of Assad's government since a 2011 uprising turned into a fully fledged war. This is, the CIA dirty war against Damascus, and has played an instrumental role in turning the tide of the conflict in his favor. Iran has sent military advisors and thousands of Iran-backed fighters to Syria to fight on Assad's side against the opposition. Tehran has also provided an economic lifeline for Assad, sending fuel and credit lines worth billions of dollars. Syrian government forces have regained control of large parts of the country in recent years with the help of Russia and Iran. The Iranian state-owned railway company has long aspired to expand its network through neighboring Iraq and Syria, linking it to the Syrian port of Latakia on the Mediterranean to boost trade. The deals are important for Syria, whose economy has hit an all-time low over the past decade, with spiraling inflation, a currency plunge, and rampant power cuts. In an interview with Pan-Arab television channel Al Mayadeen ahead of the visit, Raisi called for reconstruction efforts and for Syrian refugees who fled the country's war to return home. Syria's government and people have gone through great hardships. Syrian state media quoted Raisi as telling Assad during the meeting, "Today we can now say that you have overcome all these problems and were victorious despite the threats and sanctions imposed against you." Jabari, reporting from Tehran, said the visit signaled the Iranian leadership's strong backing for Assad. Raisi is showing the international community that Iran is very much behind Assad, and they will continue to strengthen that relationship. The main purpose of Raisi's visit is to increase, this is a quote from this reporter, increase what he calls the axis of resistance against the Israeli threat, and to strengthen economic ties and help rebuild the country after the devastating war. Israel has launched hundreds of raids into Syria over the years. We cover these almost every week, claiming it's targeting Iranian-backed forces and Lebanese Hezbollah fighters inside Syrian territory. The officials here believe they are providing assistance to a country that is very much, as they put it, helpless in the face of a number of airstrikes from Israel, Jabari said. The last Iranian president to visit Syria was President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2010. Assad has officially visited Tehran twice since the war broke out, the last time being in May 2022. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department has warned that deepening ties between Iran and the Syrian government should be of great concern to the world. Raisi's visit comes as some Arab countries, including Egypt and regional powerhouse Saudi Arabia, have been opening up to al-Assad, and their foreign ministers have visited Damascus in recent weeks. Syria's foreign minister also visited Riyadh in April, the first such visit since the two countries cut relations in 2012, and in March, they're just reiterating the normalization agreement in March that was brokered by China. Okay, so we're seeing progress here, but Israel is once again stepping up its bombing raids on Syria. So this next story is from Dave DeCamp on April 30th. This is over the weekend. Israeli airstrikes hit Syria. 3 civilians reported wounded. Israeli airstrikes hit targets near the western city of Homs early Saturday morning. According to the Syrian news agency Sana, 3 civilians were wounded in the strikes. A civilian fuel station caught fire, and a number of tankers and trucks burned as a result of the strike. The Sana report said, quote, "The Israeli enemy carried out an air attack with a number of missiles from the direction of North Lebanon, targeting several positions in the vicinity of Homs." April and March saw heavy Israeli bombardment of Syria amid a political crisis in Israel over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's judicial overhaul. A few days before the strikes in Homs, Israel shelled southern Syria and later dropped threatening leaflets in the area warning Syrian soldiers against cooperation with Hezbollah. At the beginning of April, separate Israeli attacks in Syria killed 2 members of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and 2 civilians. And in March, Israel twice targeted the Aleppo airport and temporarily put it out of service, halting earthquake aid flights into the Syrian city. While Israel frequently bombs Syria, Israeli officials rarely acknowledge the individual airstrikes. Israel frames its operations in the country as part of its campaign against Iran, although they're usually killing civilians and Syrian soldiers. All right. Okay, so continuing with this move toward normalization and sort of bringing Assad in from the cold, and this move led by Saudi Arabia, at least within the region. Then we have Russia helping to broker these talks between Damascus and Riyadh, as well as the current negotiations going on with Turkey and Syria as well. So this is from Dave again. Arab ministers call for Syria to regain control of its territory. The foreign ministers of Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt met in Amman on Monday to discuss a solution to the crisis in Syria in the latest step towards Damascus fully normalizing with regional countries. The ministers released a joint statement expressing support for Syria to regain control of all of its territory, which includes the area of eastern Syria occupied by American forces. According to the statement, the ministers agreed to work to support Syria and its institutions in any legitimate efforts to extend control over its lands and to impose the rule of law and end the presence of armed and terrorist groups on Syrian lands and stop foreign interference in Syrian internal affairs. The ministers support working to, quote, gradually reach a political solution that ends the suffering of the brotherly Syrian people and the catastrophic consequences of the Syrian crisis, that achieves national reconciliation and puts Syria on the road to reconstruction. They agreed to establish working groups to build on the progress made in the meetings. This is a quote from the Jordanian Foreign Minister, Ayman Safadi. He said, "This meeting is the beginning of an Arab-led political path to reach a solution to the crisis." Saudi Arabia and Jordan have been leading this effort to bring Syria back into the Arab League, which Damascus was expelled from in 2011. The U.S. is strongly opposed to these efforts as it prefers to keep Syria isolated under crippling economic sanctions, which are designed to prevent. Tony Blinken actually said this in 2021 in the summer. They're specifically opposed to Syria's ability to rebuild after the war, which is going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars, which is why it's also great to see these moves being made, because it's really the only way, in spite of the economic war and the constant bombardment by the Israelis and the dual occupations of Turkey and the U.S., for them to be able to have some sense of normalcy and rebuild and save their country, which has been just devastated for well over a decade now. On top of the sanctions, the U.S. has about 900 troops in eastern Syria and backs the Kurdish-led SDF, allowing the U.S. to control 1/3 of Syrian territory, an area where most of Syria's oil resources are located. If Syria normalizes with more regional countries, the U.S. would likely come under pressure from its Arab allies to withdraw and lift the sanctions. And we have heard about that previously, that there's, as part of these negotiations with these regional countries and Assad, they're talking about different things. If they can get certain concessions from him, that they would then lead essentially a lobbying effort with the in Washington to get the sanctions removed from Syria. Okay, so that occurred on Monday, and that was good news. And then that evening, Israel bombed the Syrian Aleppo airport again. So this next story is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Israeli airstrikes again target Syria's Aleppo airport. Israeli airstrikes put Syria's Aleppo airport out of service again and hit other targets on the outskirts of the city on Monday night. The strikes killed one Syrian soldier and wounded 5 more soldiers, as well as 2 civilians. A military source told the Syrian Sana news agency that around 11:35 this evening, the Israeli enemy carried out an air attack with barrages of missiles from the direction of the southeast of Aleppo, targeting Aleppo International Airport and a number of points in the vicinity of Aleppo. The incident marked the 3rd time since March that Israeli airstrikes have put the Aleppo International Airport out of service. The city was devastated by the earthquake that hit Syria and Turkey in February and has been, of course, a vital channel for aid. All right. And okay, so now we have the U.S. bombing Syria again this week. So this is a civilian report. This is from Dave DeCamp again on the 3rd. Civilian reported killed in U.S. drone strike in northwest Syria, although Washington is claiming that they killed some senior al-Qaeda leader whose name they're not willing to divulge. So CENTCOM said Wednesday that they launched an airstrike in northwest Syria that killed an al-Qaeda leader. They did not name the target or release any other details of the strike, and local reports are suggesting a civilian was killed. So CENTCOM's statement said at 11:42 a.m. local time on May 3rd, U.S. Central Command forces conducted a unilateral strike in northwest Syria targeting a senior al-Qaeda leader. According to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a drone strike hit a poultry farm in the area and killed one person that hasn't yet been identified. Local sources later told the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights that a 60-year-old sheep herder not affiliated with any military faction was killed, suggesting the strike killed a civilian. CENTCOM said it would provide more information on the strike as operational details become available. U.S. drone strikes have a history of harming civilians, and the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting or lying about civilian casualties. And this strike targeted Syria's northwest Idlib province, which is controlled by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, an al-Qaeda-linked group. This is the latest iteration of the al-Nusra Front, the Syrian branch of al-Qaeda in Iraq, which was the tip of the spear of the CIA dirty war against Damascus. And they split off with ISIS in 2013, but over a factional split. But this is essentially that same group in Idlib province. And U.S. strikes in the region have mainly targeted members of Haras al-Din and HTS al-Qaeda offshoot. U.S. drone strikes in the region have also targeted suspected ISIS members. Okay, so now just on to some Israeli stuff, some Israeli news. They're bombing Gaza again, and a very courageous Palestinian prisoner who was on a hunger strike had just died. And I'm going to do some more coverage on this guy next week because his story is, I think, very important. But just before we go here, there's an important story about what happened with Gaza. So Israeli airstrikes kill Palestinian man in Gaza. This is from Middle East Eye on the 3rd. Israel and Palestinian armed groups in the besieged Gaza Strip agreed to a day after Israeli airstrikes left one Palestinian killed. Hashem Mubarak Salman, who was 58 years old, died in overnight raids, which left at least 5 others wounded, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. 2 Palestinian officials said a reciprocal and simultaneous ceasefire went into effect at 3:30 a.m. local time to end the fighting. It was brought about with efforts from Egyptian, Qatari, and UN officials, according to Reuters. The exchange of fire came hours after 45-year-old prisoner Kader Adan died in Israeli prison after nearly 3 months of a hunger strike, which he launched following his arrest from his home in the occupied West Bank. The rocket attacks from Gaza were centered on the Israeli town of Serdot and other areas close to the frontier with Gaza. Palestinian media outlets reported explosions in the northern region of Gaza. The fighting has revived fears about an escalation of violence in the region. In April, the Israeli military launched airstrikes on Lebanon and the Gaza Strip after rockets were fired from Lebanon's south in response to the raids on the Al-Aqsa Mosque in occupied East Jerusalem. EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell urged Israel on Tuesday to halt unilateral measures that could raise tensions further in his first meeting with the Israeli foreign minister. Adan was a well-known figure in Palestine and had been arrested more than 10 times, spending a total of 8 years behind bars. A member of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad resistance group, Adan has been on a hunger strike in protest against his detention since February 5th when he was arrested at his home in Araba, a town in the occupied West Bank south of Jenin. All right, so no, it's a fascinating story. He's a very well-known, even internationally, figure, an activist against the occupation, and had led several hunger strikes in opposition to the administrative detention system, in particular, where Palestinians in the occupied territories are very often locked up without any charges and without any trials. And it's just been absolutely brutal. And he was a very inspiring figure among all Palestinians. And for him to die like this, with the Israelis just basically allowing him to just starve himself to death, was bound to provoke a reaction. And it does seem like the way the Israelis are acting right now, it does appear that things have calmed down. But again, we always have to keep an eye because things like this can spiral out of control, as we saw in May of 2021 when there was a war that broke out between Gaza and Israel. And but anyway, yeah, it's just been insane. The far right government right now is taking every opportunity they can get to escalate with the Palestinians, to bomb Syria, even bomb Lebanon, as we saw a couple of weeks ago. So we'll continue to pay attention to it and see what happens next.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for that breakdown. And everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show. We'll be back with more shows next week.
Thank you, everybody.